There is a principle of fiqh that there is neither maslahati halisa nor mafsadati halisa. In other words, nothing is completely bad and nothing is completely good.
Hello everyone from Istanbul School. Dear viewers, our guest this week is Prof. Dr. Şaban Ali Düzgün. We will talk about conservatism and secularism. Welcome, teacher.
Thank you.
How are you?
Thank you.
Conservatism and secularism are concepts that we use a lot, but we want to define them with you a little bit. What does conservatism mean in political theory? We use it more in Turkey by associating it with religiosity. What does this conservatism mean?
Well said. It is a political theory. So conservatism is not a definition of religiosity. I mean, in the process of its juxtaposition with religiosity, it seems as if religious people tend to preserve what exists. Therefore, if you are going to put the two words piety and conservatism side by side, conservatism and piety are like definitions. But today, for example, conservatism is preceded by another word like liberal conservatism. In other words, different terms are added to conservatism to show that conservatism is not just about preservation, but also has a content that includes freedoms.
It is not enough on its own.
It is not enough on its own. A political theory emerges first and foremost as a reaction to Enlightenment thought. Then we can actually learn more deeply about the genetics of conservatism by looking at what it opposes. Enlightenment gives importance to the human being. It gives importance, finds it valuable, cares about the human being's reason, and defining himself as an autonomous being through reason. Therefore, as an autonomous individual, there is a perception of the human being that starts with philosophy but gradually evolves into political theories over time, such as opposing the social living conditions that one is dissatisfied with, showing the will to evolve and transform them, even in a radical way. Conservatism wants to block an attitude, a political attitude that can evolve into radical revolutionary results by saying that such singular initiatives of the individual can give mistakes because human nature is unreliable, including reason. In other words, this prediction that conservatism can ruin society by going to radical evolutionary and revolutionary attitudes is very much related to the bad nature of human beings, and in this sense, conservatism and religiosity in Turkey do not have a strong relationship. In this sense, they are radically opposed to each other. If you look from the perspective of Christianity, if you look at the theory, or rather the belief, that human beings cannot be the source of goodness because their nature's nature is inherently bad, sinful. Conservatism has a place in Western political theories. You can also understand other theories that oppose this, such as Enlightenment thought, rationalist thought. You can understand that conservatism in the West, is a theory that confronts this enlightenment, the autonomous individual, and that society should be better because there is a process in society. In other words, according to conservatism, knowledge, accumulation, experience, and wisdom that have been tested in the process are essential. And in terms of the interests of society over the individual, the interests of society take precedence over the interests of the individual. Now, this positioning of conservatism in this way is part of your question. It is a contradiction in terms of juxtaposing the religious with the religious in Turkey. In other words, it is a contradiction in terms of fitrat, human nature. Secondly, there is also a contradiction when we take into account the basic goals and objectives inherent in the structure of religion and the results it seeks to realize. So my main question here is, when we talk in the context of religion, if the prophet of religion came to preserve and protect the existing social reality, the existing order, why did he come? I mean, it is clear that he did not come to protect the existing order. Therefore, when we ask the question, what is the purpose of the prophet's sending? What is the purpose of his intervention? We see that the goals of conservatism, that is the purpose of protecting the existing, the social status quo, work exactly the opposite there. Conservatism's discourse that individual initiatives, rational initiatives, gain radicalism in a way that revolutionizes and therefore produce risk, seems to be something said precisely against what the prophet did, because there is a Latin word, felix culpa. Felix means good news, culpa means sin, a sin that contains good news. This is exactly what prophets do. Historically speaking, they sin by rejecting social reality, the established order, habits, institutional structures, hierarchies, and relations of sovereignty. But the sin they commit ultimately contains bliss, happiness, resurrection, hope, and good news. Like what? Prophets sin because they rebel against the social conditions of their time.
In fact, they are doing something contrary.
Of course, they are doing something contrary. Here they are called Hanif, as the Holy Qur'an defines it, meaning one who follows the religion. And from which religion? The religion that is imposed on you by the existing order means order. Religion because nomos means law. Therefore, when you look at the existing law and the basic theses that organize the affairs of society, you see that the Prophet intervened in it. And when he intervened, he was targeted by the elders of the society. The Qur'an calls him al-Mutref, that is, the group of al-Mutref, which the Qur'an defines as people who are spoiled by the political and financial power they have, the singular person. So conservatism was against singularity. The Prophet takes the initiative as a singular person, that is, the person who brings religion to people. Now this singularity, that is, every opinion, especially those that contain very serious philosophical analyses, thoughts and depths, have always been considered dangerous. By whom? One, the established order, two, empires. This includes the Ottoman Empire, the Roman Empire, the British Empire. For example, the Ottoman Empire did not have a philosopher because philosophical thinking can threaten established imperial orders. The British do not have a philosopher. More than 90% of the philosophers that exist are Scottish. In other words, they are not English. Look at David Hume, look at the others. They are of Scottish descent. Come to Rome. Rome has law, but no philosophers. I mean, there are a few Stoic philosophers like Seneca. Other than that, Rome has no great philosophers because empires need law. That's why they define the Ottoman Empire as a civilization of fiqh, which means law. Because what does thinking, contemplation, the established order do?
He is threatening.
It threatens. Therefore, if you ask why conservatism opposes the singular, if you say conservatism in the end, that perception of threat also creates a perception of security in it. That is, if it perceives others as a threat, if it sees its own security at risk, what is being done in the world today is no different. In other words, you are left in a dilemma between security or freedom. It is like this all over the world. Many countries restrict your freedoms. That is why even Western democracies today, most of the texts written in the West today want illiberal democracy, non-liberal democracies. That is to say, most of these are today being certified as fascist democracies. The reason is that fascism is not fascism as we know it. I mean, it is not talking about a Hitler fascism. He is not talking about Franco-fascism. The man he is talking about is not Mussolini. In other words, he is not talking about the fascism practiced by the dictators of the fascist period. People are talking about a democratic culture that restricts the rights and freedoms that democracy brings. This is saying that this is democracy, but it is an illiberal democracy. Now, the name conservatism is also called liberal democracies to defend it today. The point is that the word liberal does not mean that the rights and freedoms, that is, natural rights, do not have to be bound by a contract, whether the state gives you that right by contract or not. whether there is a social contract or not. Even without a contract, human beings have natural rights and they need to be protected. This is what Islamic thought formulates as the 5 fundamental rights. Regardless of a person's religion, faith, or race, that person's life must be protected and safeguarded. His property must be protected. Freedom of thought, that is, his intellect, must be protected. His generation, that is, his right to raise his children in a healthy living environment, must be guaranteed, property, etc. Now, these are the things that are protected, but he says, okay, he says this much freedom, but we are under threat, others are attacking us, so now we have to give up a large part of freedom for our security. So people are left in a dilemma, freedom or security. Now, I think this is a fiction. I mean, under no circumstances should freedoms be based on human freedoms, human rights. Law, that is the basic doctrine, should be set to protect human rights and law. Everything else should always be adjusted accordingly. But in the world today, no matter which country you take into consideration, unfortunately, security is the first priority. In order to ensure security, people can spend thousands of people without recognizing rights, law, internationalism, etc. We are seeing examples of this right now. We see this in the field. It has been like this in history. In other words, extraordinary situations are actually unfair by preventing what should be the norm. But while this is being done, what is called exceptional circumstances is actually nothing but the expression of the desire for domination of the desires and whims of most people. This is the same for religions. For example, there is talk of an established religion. Let's say, what is the religion of Turkey? It is Islam. This is the established order. This is how the Seljuks and Ottomans came. There is always a risk that the established religion will evolve into a hegemonic religion. This means that it can hegemonize and dominate people who are not of that religion. Now, sometimes this hegemony is based on religion, sometimes on nationality, sometimes on race, etc. In other words, all kinds of othering, all kinds of alienation that we see in the world today, and then looking for ways to dominate and kill them. This is what is horrible. I mean, you cannot kill a person normally. What do? You takfir, you call him a heretic, and then you hang him. This is what happened in history by marginalizing, alienating. Therefore, the part of conservatism that I criticize the most is that it tries to suffocate the individual, the intellect that enables the individual to be an autonomous being, by saying that these are the basic elements of radicalism and revolution. It puts the social ahead of the individual. However, it is the benefit and utility that organizes the social. In other words, as long as it is useful, we ensure the continuation of the social, as long as it benefits me. But in the long run, this can also be a benefit that can harm us all. I always mention the hadith of our Prophet here, Kulu maludin yulidu alel fitrati, even yugrabe anhu lisanuhu, until you enter into a culture. In other words, hata yugrabi anhu lisanuhu, until you enter the environment in which a language is spoken. This is the cultural environment, the social environment. Conservatism says that society is primary, that basic judgments are produced and tested in the social process, and therefore what is produced in this process should be primary, not what is thought instantaneously. So we said that the individual suffocates the individual. What is pointed out here, what is pointed out in the hadith is this. Every born is born with a natural nature, but when he is immersed in a culture, that culture can disrupt his nature. It says that it corrupts. Therefore, attention is drawn to the deforming, corrupting feature of the social. Many people have been hanged in history. Societies have beliefs, societies have acceptances. And something is said against that social thing, and you hang the man. And then centuries pass, and it turns out that what the man said was true. Therefore, since conservatism's stance against the individual has been severely criticized, in the theoretical books written on conservatism, liberal conservatism, which they call liberal conservatism, has been added to conservatism. Where does conservatism stand here as a political theory? What is its relation to religiosity? This is the part you mentioned. There is something interesting in the second part about secularism. In other words, the secularists have a very important name in this very issue we are discussing here. St. Thomas is a very important name in Catholicism. In the interpretation of the sacred text, he asks for the first time when man is used as a legitimate being to interpret the sacred text. With what ability does man confront and interpret the sacred text? He says with his reason. For the first time, reason is mentioned as a secular element, as an instrument that confronts the sacred text. In fact, as soon as a person tries to interpret the sacred text, he is doing a secular job. So this is also very natural. Now, because there are people in our tradition, they call people who try to understand the text by using their reason, by reasoning, they call them al-ire. What does that mean? Al-ire says that there is religion here. What is religion? It is narration, news, transmission. It is over. You use your intellect in religion. So why do you oppose the use of reason? Because reason is a secular element. It doesn't make such a nomenclature there, but in the back of your mind there is this, but it is expressed there. When you do the same thing with Thomas, you say to Thomas that you are using a secular element, the intellect, as a tool to understand religion. This is a mistake because your mind does this as a product of a contaminated, evil, sinful nature. He says you cannot bring it closer to the sacred. Now, without naming it, in the debate between al-Hadith and al-Ray in our country, that is, when we look at the content of the first period books of the Sunnites, the language they use against al-Ray is as if they are waging war against an enemy. They use a language to fight against them. Tekfir has a tendency to throw these people out of religion very easily. Now, when I was saying this, I remembered the following words of a man called Tertullianus, who was one of the founding fathers in the church, which we call the patristic period. The man says, what are Athenians doing in Jerusalem? What he means is that Athens is the capital of philosophy, the capital of reason. Jerusalem is the capital of religion. What are the Athenians doing in Jerusalem? He says the same thing. He says, what are they doing in religion? Why? Because when interpreting the sacred text with the interpretations made by the intellect, the text is revealed a second time, a second time, a second time, when you bring it down to your own world as much as possible. In other words, the text has been revealed once, and when you interpret it, you realize the event of Nazil Nuzul in your own world again. Now he says that he may make a mistake here. Why would it make mistakes? For Christianity, I understand, because the man makes mistakes because he accepts human nature as sinful. But how is the mind in us? Aha, you say, brother, take this mind as Zakaria Erazi describes it in his book Et Tiburuhani. Or take it as Al-Ghazali defines it in Mishkat al-Anwar. The definition of both is this. They give the same definition. Al-Aqlu Mizanulahi fil art. The intellect is the scales of Allah on earth. So our tradition is that these two names I mentioned, Zakaria Erazi, are defined as heretics. Al-Ghazali, on the contrary, is defined in the most religious section. This is the definition that they both agree on, that they agree on the intellect. The intellect is the scales of Allah on earth. Why? Because there is no problem in the nature of the human being who will use that intellect. Therefore, secularism is a political theory, a social theory, rather than a political theory. In other words, secularism is a theory that says that religion should withdraw from society, that it should be confined to one's private life, one's private sphere, but in this sense, secularism is a theory that does not find a response in any way. Finally, before his death, in Peter Berger's book, The Multiple Altarpieces of Modernity, when he talks about multiple modernities, he says that secularism's prediction that religion should withdraw its hands from social life and only enter the private life and private sphere of the individual did not find a response. No, he says, such a world did not exist, because today in both political and social theories, political movements and party propaganda, references to super-identities, national identities and religious identities are high. In other words, there has never been such a licking, such a sterile space for religion, such a thing as let's keep it in one's private life. Therefore, today, there is a definition of secularism called post-secularism. Post-secularism is something that rightly criticizes this claim of secularism as a moral element both in one's life and in social life. So I see this discussion of religion as the source of norms, as the source of judgments, as a demagogy, as an attempt to block religion by highlighting 3-5 jurisprudential provisions in order to say that religion should not be present in the public sphere. Either this is an ethical debate. In an ethical debate, I say whoever has an instrument to build the social in a good way is welcome, whether they come from the East or the West. We need to look at it with this breadth. As I said, secularism as a social theory says that it wants to build a society in which religion is removed, but I'm trying to show that secularism shows itself as a very natural flow because secularism is a world that people build by using their reason and humanity. If you use your intellect while interpreting that holy book just now, in fact, inevitably a reconciliation between the two worlds, a reconciliation between what is put forward as religion and what is put forward as religion should be a reconciliation, not a conflict, because if you block a world in which humanities function, if you slaughter the potentials of the human, in this sense, a radical opposition to enlightenment, secularism in this sense without understanding what it is, what it promises, what it realizes wrongly, that is, a radical opposition without seeing all these at the same time, a critique, is troublesome. It does not produce a good analysis because it is useful to look at it. This is still an issue on the table. That is to say, this secularism and post-secularism are still being debated in some way. So we are not talking about a finished process.
No matter how much it is opposed and fought, this concept or its usage in everyday language is still a concept that continues in its natural flow. In other words, it is something that we are obliged to continue and are a part of.
So nothing is like this. Let me just say this from my last evaluation here. There is a principle of fiqh that there is neither maslahati halis nor mafsadati halis. In other words, nothing is completely bad and nothing is completely good. There are good sides and bad sides, therefore we test and learn in the process. Therefore, whether it is conservatism or secularism, what did they promise? What has been realized? We are talking about theories that are 300, 400 years old. That's why post-secularism emerges. Post-conservatism is emerging. These are about the human being, society, and the state. What did they say? Where did they fail? It is useful to look at this picture and make future projections.
Okay, teacher, thank you very much.
Conservatism, secularism, you have created a very clear picture. Thank you very much for your comments.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Dear audience, this week we talked about the issue of conservatism and secularism with our guest, Prof. Dr. Şaban Ali Düzgün. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.